I'm Robbie Parks.
And I'm Nate Matthews Trigg.
And this is Surviving the Climate, a podcast that gives practical advice for regular people on how to deal with the climate crisis.
Today, we're going to talk about how to play sports, work, and exercise outside safely in hot temperatures. We'll be speaking with Professor Ollie Jay at the University of Sydney, who helped establish cutting-edge heat stress equipment and protocols at the Australian Open tennis tournament. Man, Robbie, we've been reading Ollie Jay's research since we first met back in 2017, and I really can't think of a better inaugural interview for this podcast. So, Robbie, what excites you about having Ollie Jay on today?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Nate. I think, Ollie is, as I've mentioned before, a great friend of the show, really in the spirit of surviving the climate, really solid science, but also really relevant to what we're experiencing today and these days with the climate crisis and really, really extreme heat. I think in recent times, Ollie's been particularly relevant with his work on the Australian Open and heat protection there. Of course, right now it's the Men's Football World Cup at the time of recording, and Ollie has been really prominent in trying to expound exactly the risks there. He happens to be a Tottenham fan in the Premier League, but that's okay. No one's perfect. But, in terms of having him on the podcast, I think he is not only an excellent scientist, but can really explain complicated things in easily understandable ways. So, just an all-round top lad, really good, clear scientist and really clear thinker.
Quick note to our listeners, this interview was recorded on May 6th, and I guess for Ollie Jay, it was May 7th. All right, let's jump into it.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover. Can't wait to hear this. Professor Ollie Jay.
Ollie, thank you again so much for joining us on the show.
Pleasure. Great to see you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ollie. So as our guests, we always ask the same question first. How would you sort of describe your work with your family and friends or sort of non-specialists?
How to describe me? Yeah, well, I this is something I need to do. I've got a 6-year-old, and so she's just started going to school. And so she has to explain to her teachers and her friends, or mummy and daddy does. And I say I'm a scientist, really, trying to kind of better understand the way in which hot weather impacts people. But it's not just really focusing on how it impacts people, it's figuring out solutions. So trying to utilize that information to derive solutions that are fit for purpose in the settings in which people find themselves.
Yeah, we love that at Surviving the Climate because it's sort of our sort of ideas are really what people can do, the solutions, really highlighting the problems, but also the solutions. So we love that.
Yeah, it's a real problem at the moment, I think, because we're kind of inundated with being told how terrible everything is, which is important, right, for the public discourse. But I think people, want hope as well. So this is, hopefully we're in the hope business as well as the fear business as well. So.
Yeah, and Ollie, just looking at some of your research, I keep seeing this thing called a climate chamber mentioned. Some of the research shows it talks about simulating environmental conditions of past, present, and future climates. What does this look like? How do you use it, and how does it inform your work?
Yeah. So, so we have a climate. So, our climate chamber is pretty unique, but it's not to say that it's the only climate chamber in the world. There's lots of, there's a community of thermal physiologists across the world and a climate chamber is a pretty basic kind of component of a lot of the laboratories. So I don't want to pass it off as being the only one, but it is pretty unique in the way in which we've developed it. So the way climate change chambers work is that they're basically like a big room. And in it, you can really precisely control the temperature, the humidity. We have lamps that simulate the effect of solar radiation from the sun. You can move air in different ways. And so the reason that's important is because the way in which a hot climate impacts people is through 4 different environmental parameters: temperature, humidity, radiation, and wind. And if we can manipulate all 4 of those parameters, and effectively what we do is that we simulate the types of conditions that people have been exposed to in the past that we know have been damaging to human health. So, for example, we came up with this idea in about 2016, 2017, where we're trying to help people understand what we do. So the way we couched it is that we simulate heat waves of the past, or at least the peak heat wave conditions of the past, and expose human participants to these conditions. And we use physiological biomarkers to get a sense of how their body's coping. So we measure how hot people get through measuring their core temperature. We measure how much work their heart has to do, because that's a really important component of survivability when it comes to people with heart disease exposed to extreme heat. We measure how dehydrated people become, maybe how much strain their kidneys are under, and things like this. And so what it does, it enables us to understand how people respond to these conditions. And then it also gives us a setting to then systematically test the potential efficacy of different low resource, simple, scalable interventions. So basically we do this kind of a repeated measures design, which basically means is that you get people, you bring them in, you expose them to one set of conditions. You then bring them in on another day, you expose them to the same set of conditions, but with a different intervention. Let's say an electric fan, applying water to the skin surface. And then from that, we can see which interventions are successful at reducing how much work the heart has to do, which can be dangerous for people with heart disease, or how dehydrated they become, etc. Then we can use that information to try to inform what we're telling people to do during extreme heat events to try to reduce their health risk. Another thing I'll just quickly say as well is that we've equipped this chamber to not just be capable of simulating heat waves of the past. We also work with climate scientists to understand what the heat waves of the future are going to look like with different carbon emissions. And one of the challenges for people to understand what the future is going to mean for them, or different versions of the future, is that it doesn't really resonate. You know, we're talking about 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius of average global warming, but what does that mean for me, right? What does it mean? And so what we know is in the future is going to give rise, more warming is going to give rise to more heat waves and more severe heat waves. And so we can kind of estimate what the severity of those heat waves might look like and create those different visions of the future now and show what it does to people. And hopefully use that as a means of trying to get people to think a bit more seriously about the decisions that we make now that are going to affect the types of conditions we're going to be experiencing in the future.
That's fascinating. And, you know, you talk about really simulating the future based on different carbon emissions. I mean, it almost sounds like an advocacy tool, right? Have you ever brought in a policymaker into your climate chamber and said, you know, experience these conditions and then make your policy choices, right?
Yeah, sure. So we work with a range of different external stakeholders because, you know, one of the things that I kind of, you know, or we figured out pretty quickly is that, you know, as scientists, we can do our nice research, we can get our stuff published in really nice journals, but it kind of stops there for most people. And in my opinion, there's no point in doing the work unless it translates into changes in policy and practice. So this kind of second part of doing the science, but then translating that into changes in what people are doing and the types of policies that we have is really, really essential. So to that point, you know, yeah, we do try to engage with different stakeholders in that regard quite a lot. So, you know, we have politicians that have visited us and we put them in the chamber. We had Andrew Forrest, who's a philanthropist who's very interested in this area. We invited him to come and experience what a 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature condition actually feels like. Things like this. Yeah, so it is a very effective way of getting people to understand what it means because you can feel it, right? And that's really important because I think the challenge that we have with respect to extreme heat is that it's not a visual kind of impact, right? It's not like big cracks opening up in the ground or floods or things. Not that it's a competition, but it's just not visually dramatic. And so we need to find kind of more creative ways of trying to get people to have it resonate with them because you can't see it.
Yeah, and it just sort of reminded me of a story when I was at COP30 in Belém in Brazil, and the negotiating room, that the AC broke, And then there was this story that was going viral where people were sort of trying to stand up and their chairs were sticking to their bodies as they were standing up. And I sort of thought, it's uncomfortable, but maybe actually that would provide a sort of way to focus the mind, not quite as scientifically as what you're describing, Ollie, but certainly might have a similar effect. And I mean, I could see so many applications, and I'm sure you're going to tell us about them. But one of the key ones that we're really interested in is sports and your sort of experience in sports and, the sort of practicalities of it. And so we'll get to, I'm sure, lots of different things. But in general, what's the sort of considerations that people should really take into account when playing sports in hot temperatures?
The type of things that people should be thinking about is, probably first of all is it's not just about temperature. So a lot of people don't realize that the temperature that is reported on a weather forecast or on your app on your phone, that's actually measured in the shade. And a lot of sporting activities actually take place out in the open, often in direct sunlight. And so here in Australia, in the middle of the summer, if you measure something called black globe temperature, which takes into account the additional thermal radiation or the thermal load that comes from radiation from the sun, that black globe temperature is often at least 15 degrees Celsius. So what is that? That's about 22 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than, more than that, sorry, about 26 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than it is in the shade. So you're exposed to much higher temperatures effectively if you're in the sun than in the shade. So that's the first thing. Whether it's windy, that makes a big difference. Whether it's humid or not, obviously makes a big difference. When we're physically active, especially when the temperatures exceed 35 degrees Celsius, which is around about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the only way in which we can physiologically keep cool is by sweating, and that sweat's got to evaporate. If you've got high humidity with low wind speed, you can't evaporate that sweat, and that becomes really problematic. And you're also creating a lot of heat from inside the body that you've got to get rid of to stop yourself from overheating. And that kind of scales with, depending on the activity that you're doing, the intensity of the activity and the duration of the exposure as well. There's lots of different things that people need to think about. It's quite complicated, and we've started developing tools that really simplify that process for people so they can make easy decisions that are based on science without having to have all these complicated kind of considerations to take account.
I'm curious if there are differences between sports. For example, the distance between short distance running, long distance running, playing football, or just throwing around the frisbee. Like, are there certain differences that people should be aware of?
Yeah, definitely. So duration of exposure is really important. So the best example that we have here in Australia is cricket is a very popular sport, and you can be playing cricket all day long, right? So you can have like a long exposure to a set of conditions, depending on how the play is going and what type of version of the sport you're playing, versus, doing a sprinting activity where you have high intensity, but it's for a short duration. So those things really matter. So the way in which we kind of look at it is that we think about the intensity and duration of the activity that the athlete is engaging in. That scales across sports, but it also scales across levels of competition within a given sport. But there's also the equipment, right? So some sports have protective equipment. I know American football is a good example, probably, where you've got helmets, you've got shoulder pads, you've got some padding on your legs, where you have quite a lot of equipment that is impeding the ability of the body to evaporate sweat. And so you need to take into account that, and also the clothing coverage as well. And so in many of these sports, the ability to modify that clothing in response to the heat is probably, it's pretty limited, particularly if you're competing in actual games matches. I know, in American football, for example, one of the things that they introduced probably about 20, 25 years ago is during the first few days of training camp, which was really, really hot. The idea is that the players aren't fully acclimatized, is that they have this graded introduction of intensity, but also the equipment as well. And the thinking behind that is that you're giving the athletes an opportunity to adapt to the conditions before they're exposed to this kind of full suite of thermal risk that they might experience.
And Ollie, this is a great transition to talk about acclimatization. What is it, and should everyday people be doing it?
Yeah. So So acclimatization, it's kind of a term that gets thrown around quite a lot. And it's probably, this is a good opportunity maybe just to drill into the details a little bit. So if you think about acclimatization, there's really kind of two parts to it. There is the physiological acclimatization, which is a real thing, and it's very, very powerful. And then there's the behavioral adaptation, which is equally as powerful, but the timelines and the methods with which we acquire is very, very different. So let's focus on the physiological component first. So when you're fully heat acclimatized, so biologically adapted to the heat, you have these adjustments inside the body that are really protective. First of all, your resting core temperature drops down by about 0.4 degrees Celsius, or 0.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And this basically gives you more headroom before you get to those really dangerous internal body temperatures. So you're starting from a lower value, which is very beneficial, right? You start activating your sweating response earlier. Your maximum sweat rate is higher, so your capacity for evaporative heat loss is improved. You also have these adaptations that happen inside in the circulatory system as well. So one of the big problems that people have is that your heart has to do a lot of work when you're exposed to the heat, because it's redistributing all this blood away from the body core towards the skin in an effort to try to keep cool. This then kind of deprives your muscles of oxygen delivery, which then compromises performance. When you acclimatize, you have an expansion of your blood volume through an increase in plasma volume, and which basically means you've got more blood inside the body. And so basically gives you more to distribute. And so what we see is that your heart rate for a given activity in a given environment drops down by like 20 to 30 beats per minute when you're fully heat acclimatized versus non-heat acclimatized. So it's a huge difference. And the good thing about that is that your heart rate or your cardiovascular strain is often coupled with your level of exertion, your perceived exertion. So how difficult a given task actually feels. So you might be, thinking that you're doing this activity and you're like thinking this is really, really difficult. But when you're heat acclimatized, you're doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same environment, and it feels much, much easier. It's not necessarily because you're getting aerobically fitter, even though you might be a little bit. It's this acclimatization effect, which is really profound. Now that's great, right? But then the question is, what kind of forcing function, what kind of stimulus do you need to give to people to induce those adaptations? And the bad news is that there's actually quite a lot. So thermal physiologists like myself and my colleagues around the world, we do heat acclimation protocols, which is where we purposefully expose people to our climate chambers and go through a particular set of activities to try and induce these adaptations. And what we know is that you've probably got to expose people to at least 7 consecutive days of them exercising at a moderate to vigorous intensity in hot and humid conditions. So, 100 degrees Fahrenheit plus with high humidity for basically 2 hours. So you're doing that every day for 7 consecutive days. And it's only when you do that do you kind of really get this. You get about 80 or 90% of these adaptations inside the body. You need to do it for like 2 weeks to get the full adaptation. So now if you then compare that to what people are actually exposed to in the real world, particularly with the prevalence of things like air conditioning in workplaces, in vehicles, in homes, now you're saying, oh, well, actually, it's probably unlikely that we're exposed to that much of a stimulus to actually induce enough of this. So yes, it can be good. Yes, it can be protective. Do people expose themselves to the conditions sufficiently in order to induce it? Probably not. So we need to think about ways in which people can safely do it. Because the trouble is that people who are most vulnerable are probably, you don't want them to expose them to the stimulus that could be deadly in the effort to get them to adapt. So that's a kind of a careful kind of balancing act that we need to think about. Very briefly, the behavioral adaptations are really important as well. So this is thinking about what you can do in order to avoid heat. So seeking shade, seeking airflow, adapting your clothing, et cetera, That's really powerful. Often what we see is that this is learned behavior, often passed down through generations. So we look to the indigenous communities here in Australia, try to get indigenous knowledge related to those types of behavioral adaptations, because 60,000 years of adaptation of knowledge is available. And so learning from that, if we didn't do that, that would be foolish, I think.
And Ollie, is there any benefit to people, going into a hot sauna, a hot tub, trying to do this on their own? Or is it really unrealistic, especially for those that might be more vulnerable, and thus also it sounds like could potentially benefit the most.
Yeah, there's some good research that's been done. There's a group at Bangor University in the UK, for example, have looked at this, and other people as well. The idea of, can you induce heat adaptation through purposeful kind of hot water immersion in a bath or in a sauna and things like that. And there's some pretty good data indicating that you can induce a certain level of adaptation. I think it's fair to say that it's not equivalent to the full adaptation that you get. But you can do it. The key is making sure that you do it safely, right? And so, in the people that need it the most, these are the people who are most sensitive to the stimulus that induces the adaptation. So kind of thinking about ways in which that can be done safely is really an emerging area of research. Yeah. So if people are going to try it at home, do it with caution and make sure that you're not exposing yourself to too much risk before you completely adapt it.
And Ollie, I've seen some of your research looking at the fan first method. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that might fit into this, kind of how to better acclimatize?
Yeah. So, we've done quite a lot of work, and other groups have done it as well, looking at the way in which electric fans can help or not help during extreme heat events. In fact, it was actually in New York City, their heat health guidelines back in the 90s, and it's still the same. They say, you should be turning fans off when it exceeds, I think they say 95 degrees Fahrenheit, so 35 degrees Celsius. So we were quite interested in trying to lean into, all right, what's the evidence behind that? And it turned out there wasn't really any evidence. And so, we did a series of, I know those as well, of lab studies trying to get a better answer to that question. And what we see is that there's no evidence of any harm of fan use when it's used below 40 degrees Celsius. We've generated some data that shows that people with heart disease, for example, are really much better off with a fan without a fan than without a fan at 38 degrees Celsius and high humidity. So exactly the type of conditions that you'd see on the eastern seaboard of the US, for example. But then the question is, okay, well, you do get diminishing returns as it gets hotter and more humid. And even when it's very dry as well, it becomes problematic. So the question is, well, what can you do instead of that? And, a lot of people do have air conditioning, but the problem often is that they're worried about how much it's going to cost them. So what we wanted to do is say, okay, well, let's see if we can come up with a way in which we can utilize this device paired with an air conditioner to reduce the amount of time that you actually use your air conditioner, but without compromising people's thermal comfort or safety. So we kind of landed on this thing called a fan first cooling strategy. We've been working on it here at the University of Sydney. It's a great group at the University of California, Berkeley, who's also been leading work on this area as well. And so the idea is that if you take air and you move that air across the skin surface, you can get more cooling out of that air in terms of how it impacts the body by moving it rather than keeping it still. And it's not an obvious kind of intuitive thing, right? You take air that's 22 degrees Celsius, you move that air across the skin, it feels cooler. The air's not cooler, you're cooler, right? So it gives us an opportunity. So if you move the air across the skin, it makes that temperature of the air feel about 4 degrees Celsius or 7 degrees Fahrenheit cooler. It's not cooler, but it feels cooler, and it effectively is cooler from the cooling of the body. So this gives you an opportunity to increase the set point of your air conditioner when it turns on to cool. And so if you're moving air first, you're using a fan first, and you increase the set point of your air conditioners to start cooling at 27 degrees Celsius, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, instead of what it would be, high 60s Fahrenheit or low 20 degrees Celsius. What you find is that the air conditioner turns on later in the day. It's not working as hard during the day. It turns off earlier in the day. And you feel just as cool because we're focusing on cooling you because we're moving air across the skin. And we're chilling the air when it needs to be chilled, not at this lower temperature. And we said, okay, well, we published this paper back in Lancet Planetary Health back in 2022. Said, okay, if everybody in Australia adopted this strategy, how much of a reduction in electricity consumption would we get for using air conditioning? And we found that you'd conservatively get a 70% reduction in electricity consumption from air conditioning use. And air conditioning is the number one line item on most people's electricity bill. And we also did a greenhouse gas abatement cost analysis. So I didn't do it. I don't have their expertise, but we've had some sustainability experts who did it. And they said, okay, well, what you can do is that you do a cost benefit analysis of how much it costs to implement this intervention, which is pretty low, and you compare it to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that you get from this reduced electricity consumption, particularly when that electricity has been generated by fossil fuel power plants. They did all the maths, and they came up with a greenhouse gas abatement cost that was actually lower than anything that's been done before from an adaptation perspective. The best thing that we could have done before is when everybody switched from incandescent lighting to LED lighting. And everybody did that about 15 years ago. There was funny squiggly bulbs, and it was good for the environment, right? So what we estimate based on our analysis is that this fan-first cooling strategy is better than that for reducing greenhouse gas emissions relative to the cost of the intervention. Now, this is all modeling, this is theoretical, and we're undertaking now a series of field studies to try to understand what are the barriers to implementation, what kind of nudges can you provide to try to incentivize people to adopt this strategy? What kind of, what ideological differences exist that would make people resistant to adopting this? There's going to be things, right? Particularly in a very politically charged climate that we find ourselves in. But the potential for gains are absolutely enormous with this strategy. It's really scalable. It's really simple. Everyone can do it. And it's potentially really, really effective. If we do these field trials and we only find a 20 or 15% reduction, still a huge reduction, but the potential is huge. So that's something that we're really interested in working with researchers around the world and public health organizations around the world in trying to scale up and understand how this theory translates into practice.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of thinking about, there's every day, but then there's also the sort of elite athletes who are sort of being outside and they sort of have to perform at the highest level. It's certainly in a running trend, which I'm particularly interested in, is sort of how people are sort of including heat as a central part of their strategy to get fitter. Sort of like altitude training. I was just curious, in the 80s, it might have been wearing a tracksuit in heat, but now there's sort of more advanced, fancy ways to do it. Like, what's sort of the science behind this? Is it similar to the stuff you were talking about before? And does it work? Can it be very dangerous?
Yeah. Okay. So the principles are exactly the same as the acclimatization process that I described before, right? So what they're trying to do is induce these biological adaptations inside the body, which do improve performance, particularly if you're going to be competing in a hot environment, right? The benefit, or if you're going to be competing in a cool environment, probably pretty negligible. But if you're going to be competing in a hot environment, you definitely want to be heat acclimatized. And there's different ways in which you can kind of induce that. You often see it, and we'll see it in the coming weeks with the Football World Cup that's coming to you guys in a matter of weeks, which I'm really excited about as a massive football fan. I'm also a Tottenham Hotspur fan, so I'm looking forward to seeing some high quality football for a change. So what you see is all these teams trying to adapt, right, in advance of being exposed to these really punishing conditions. And we know that it's coming in the US. There's problems with the Club World Cup last summer. Right. And it's a training as well as the games, probably training more than the games, actually. There's different ways in which you can do this. So you can work with people like ourselves who have these climate chambers to try to then put the players through the paces to induce these adaptations. But if you don't have access to those types of facilities, or it just isn't logistically possible, you can use these other types of approaches. And so one thing that's been looked at quite recently, it's something that's been around for a while, but some good data that's come out from Nisha Shakudian's team, where they've looked at this idea of overdressing as a means of trying to induce this heat acclimatization. So if you can't kind of exercise in a chamber that has these conditions generated, what you can do is insulate the body, trying to induce the heat, because it's the heat strain in the body, how much strain your body's under, that actually induces these adaptations. So you can do that. So there's some pretty nice recent data that's demonstrated that you can feasibly do that pretty effectively. To your question about it being dangerous, it can be dangerous. So I always use this in a class that I used to teach on environmental physiology. I think his name is Martin Lawrence, an actor. He was in Bad Boys with Will Smith all those years ago, right? And there's a story I used to tell about him is that I think he was trying to prepare for a particular role. And so I think he was trying to lose body weight or something like this. And so the story goes is that he went for a run on a really hot day in LA wearing kind of, what you call a sweatsuit. which is basically a plastic bag that you wear, which prevents the sweat from evaporating. The idea is that it puts a lot of thermal strain. And I think in that particular case, he's thinking of trying to lose body weight through water loss, which didn't really make sense because all you're doing is depleting your body water stores, which you have to replenish for health reasons. But anyway, he ended up getting hospitalized with severe heat exhaustion on the verge of it potentially being heat stroke. Wow. And so that was like a medical emergency. And that's an example of it happened many, many years ago. And you know, you do see that every now and again. So it can be dangerous. One thing I would say is that, you know, people talk a lot about heat stroke. Often you hear people say, "Oh, I had a touchy heat stroke yesterday." You didn't, because you would be here talking about it if you did. You know, heat illnesses exist on a continuum. Start off with mild heat exhaustion to more severe heat exhaustion that can then evolve into heat stroke. And heat stroke is a really serious condition, and it's a medical emergency, and it can be fatal. Basically, what happens is that you're redirecting all this blood to the skin, and it deprives your gut of blood flow and oxygen, and that causes the endothelial tissue in your gut to start to become more leaky, particularly when it's really hot, and the bacteria starts leaking out, enters the circulation. It sets off this cascade of events that result in multiple organ failure and death. So that's heat stroke, and so you don't get a touch of that. But you know, it's really important for people to understand that heat can be deadly, and it can affect anyone. You know, we've seen elite athletes die of heat stroke. Corey Stringer in the NFL was a very high profile case back in 2001. He died of heat stroke. So yeah, that's something for people to keep in mind. It's not just something that affects elderly people or people with heart disease. It can affect everybody.
Right. And on the opposite scale, you know, you've got sports people sort of wearing, you know, more fancy technology. It can be sort of cooling vests, cooling headbands. It could even be sort of neck fans or wearable AC. I mean, what's your opinion on this in the sort of movement towards that in some sports? Like, can you imagine, for example, elite athletes wearing, you know, AC units during a marathon, or like even recreational athletes? Like, what's your sort of view on the whole thing?
Yeah, mobile AC units. God. Yeah, it's a pretty scary kind of adaptation, isn't it, to the crisis that we're facing? Yeah, you know, I mean, I think that's probably a bit much. I think one of the things that people really underestimate is the power of evaporation for cooling. We kind of get pretty preoccupied with the idea of high temperatures, and temperature being the only problem. Therefore, the only solution is reducing the temperature. And this is why AC's got such a foothold. You know, convection it can be effective under certain conditions, but also applying water to the skin surface is a really effective way and it's a cheap and scalable way of keeping cool. We did so with a PhD student of mine, Nate Morris, who's now down in Colorado. We did this article a few years ago where we kind of looked at a situation if you're an athlete and you've got 500 milliliters of water, so just like a pint of water. And you got that pint of water, and you're running a marathon, half marathon, or whatever it might be. From a cooling perspective, what is the best thing you can do with that water? And most of us would think, oh, well, I've just got to drink as much of it as possible. But that causes gastric distress. It's pretty difficult to neck 500 mils of water. And so we did the kind of calculation. We said, all right, if you take 500 mils of cold water, let's say 5 degrees Celsius water, and you compare how much heat loss you get from ingesting all of that water, and your body then warms it up to body temperature, so it cools your body down. If you compare how much heat loss you get from conduction of that, and then you compare it to saying, oh, I just take the water and pour it over my head, you only need 6% of the water that you've poured over yourself to evaporate in order to get the same level of cooling that you would if you ingested the whole thing at 5 degrees Celsius. And this is because you lose so much heat via evaporation. And so the indirect answer to your question, Robbie, is that what we're kind of looking at here is really thinking about utilizing that process to help keep people cool. One of the things that, you know, is often a missed opportunity is it's actually wetting your uniform if it's feasible to do so. And then that water then evaporates, and it just liberates an awful lot of heat. Plus, it reduces how much water you're going to lose subsequently through sweating, because it does the job that sweating doesn't have to anymore. So that's another way of thinking about it. That's a bit more scalable, definitely low tech. Often, you know, when we talk about the work that we do, where we're trying to look at scalable ways of keeping people safe and cool during extreme heat events, be they athletes or vulnerable people in the community. Some people are often quite disappointed that the types of things that we're talking about are really low-tech solutions, but they're low-tech for a purpose because they've got to be scalable, and the most vulnerable people need to be able to do them. And so that's kind of really our philosophy with the stuff that we're doing.
This is super interesting, Ollie, and it seems like very practical advice for the people listening or watching this. That just, if you're feeling hot, pour water on yourself. That's probably going to be more effective than trying to chug as much water as possible.
Right.
Yeah. And then, it seems like with all of these like very low cost interventions, the real gap is just people knowing what to do and when to do it. So, I'd love to hear you talk about the heat stress scale for the Australian Open that you helped develop, and how that like informs the athletes on like when to take breaks, when to drink water, all of this information.
Yeah, back in 2018, the new chief medical officer, Carolyn Bodrick, who is now a member of our center, actually, brought us in to try to solve the problem that they had in the Australian Open. It's in January every year, middle of our summer, so it's super hot, and there's been lots of problems with disruptions of play and things like that. And I think back in 2014, which is the first summer that I was here after I moved here from Canada, I think 9 players dropped out in the first round because of heat exhaustion, which is huge.
Wow.
And so, so the question was like, when do you act? How do you prepare? And then what do you do when you implement a solution? So the first thing is trying to get the players and the stakeholders to understand how hot is too hot. And so the first question is like, when do you stop? And the thing is, then what we wanted to do is really focus on the problem being the hot athlete in the hot environment, not the hot environment per se. And so, because that's what gives rise to the strain, the reduction in performance, the symptoms of heat exhaustion, is because the player is overheating. So what can we do? What can we implement in a graded fashion? So it's not just a matter of a stop or go decision, carry on or stop. It's implementing these evidence-based strategies to try to keep the players cool as that heat stress risk escalates. So we landed on this 5-point scale called the Australian Open Heat Stress Scale. And basically you've got zones. So zone 1 is basically normal playing conditions, drink to thirst, etc. When it tips into a 2, this is when we implement another intervention. You say, okay, well, you need to upregulate your water ingestion, start drinking water before you're feeling thirsty, because what we know is that by the time you're feeling thirsty, you're probably dehydrated to the point that it's going to be pretty difficult to recover that. Then when it goes into a 3, this is an escalating heat stress risk. This is when we start applying evidence-based cooling strategies during the break. So we did some lab work about 10 years ago where we showed with different simulated tennis conditions. We simulated the US Open, but we simulated the Australian Open as well. And we tested these different strategies that the players could use during the breaks in play. And we tested these ice towels, and they work really well at reducing core temperature, reducing perceived exertion, things like that. So in the Australian Open, that's pretty much the only intervention that you get to use now, because based on those data, that's what we implement, so we know it works really well. And then when it gets to a 4, this is when it's even more a higher risk. This is where we start implementing breaks. So for the women, because it's Grand Slam tournament, it's best of 5. For men, best of 3 for women. For the women, we have a 10-minute break after the second set. And for the men, it's a 10-minute break after the third set. And then when it escalates to a 5, this is where we suspend play on the outer courts. And if there's play taking place on the stadium courts, they shut the roof and they turn the air conditioning on. And so that's the scale. So the idea is that what we're doing is implementing these controls as the risk escalates in an effort to try to keep the athletes cool despite the hot environment. And what this ultimately does, it actually pushes out the maximum conditions at which you ultimately have to suspend play. And the good thing is that it's anchored in physiological modeling and scientific evidence. So it's immediately defensible. There's no ambiguity. It's clear. Everybody understands what the rules are. And it just takes a lot of stress out of the situation. Carolyn, I think she wouldn't mind me quoting her. She said, when she first started as chief medical officer of the Australian Open, she said heat was her number one thing used to keep her awake at night. And now she doesn't even have to think about it because we've got this system in place. Very briefly, a key thing is that you need to have the right information that's flowing in to that algorithm. So we've built this algorithm which generates the heat stress scale number, 1 to 5 to a decimal point, which then triggers these actions. But you got to make sure you got the right information going in, because you get junk coming in, you're gonna have junk coming out. So what we did is that we realized that the local weather conditions didn't really align with the type of conditions that are experienced courtside by the players. And remember, it's the players' heat strain that we're concerned about. So we developed these devices called emus. It's a flightless Australian bird, but also the environmental measurement unit, which measures the 4 environmental parameters: ambient temperature in the shade, mean radiant temperature, wind speed and direction, and humidity. And we integrate them with local measurements that are measured live courtside from 5 sites around the Australian Open complex. It feeds into a central dashboard that then integrates all the information and gives a really simple decision-making framework for the tournament referee, for the chief medical officer, for the CEO. And so we've kind of done it that way to have this kind of a complete system that really provides a nice way. Now, in terms of that work, it's great for these kind of quite decadent settings for millionaire athletes, etc. It's really exciting. People like it. But then the question for me was, how do we then leverage that experience and that knowledge and apply it to the general population in the context of sport, but also in the context of public health? So we then subsequently kind of packaged that knowledge and delivering it in a freely accessible way to grassroots people for sport, and also in a different way through a tool that we developed called HeatWatch, which is, again, kind of using the same principles, but really in a public health setting. So I can tell you more about that if you're interested.
You explained very clearly, Ollie, the Australian Open with a very clear scale. I mean, other sports, it seems to me, don't seem to have that level of sophistication. Have you sort of ever watched a sporting event and thought, my goodness, this really should not continue because it's too dangerous? I mean, you did talk about the Club World Cup. I know last year that there was measures that people, and water breaks and stuff like that. But have you sort of thought of something while watching or being a spectator or even playing, actually?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've worked with other sports. So we work with rugby, we work with World Rugby, we work with the NRL here in Australia. We've got another World Cup coming soon. That's how I first got involved, actually, in this sport work, is that rugby league is a pretty small sport internationally, but it's played in certain areas in the UK, obviously in Australia and other places. Then we had a World Cup that was they were going to have games in Cairns, Darwin, and Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea in November, which is where it's super hot and super humid. And we've got teams coming from Wales and Scotland arriving in November, right? And so we're like, oh my goodness, are we going to, these people can die, from heat stroke. The risk is really high. So what can we do to try to this is where the first kind of management system was developed, and it's kind of evolved from there. We've done a lot of work with Cricket Australia as well. So we developed a system they use across all their Sheffield Shield games, all of their pathway games as well. But football, soccer is probably the most prominent example where they do have escalating heat stress risk problems. They use the WBGT system, the Wet Bulb Globe Temperature Index, which is, it's a pretty antiquated index, to be honest. It was developed in the 50s to protect military recruits in the deep south in the US from getting exertional heat illness. And so that same index is basically now migrated for use into different settings. And it's being used with a degree of success in sporting settings and occupational settings. But what we're seeing is that there are limitations. So it's quite surprising to see, high profile organizations like FIFA, for example, persevering with a WBGT index when there's probably something better that they could use that could give them more refined decision making and interventions that really focus on keeping the players kind of optimally conditioned and safe during games and training as well.
You made me think of the last World Cup where it was actually moved into the winter time in Qatar, and I was just curious. Do you think that's kind of the inevitable future of some of this? Can you imagine the Australian Open moving to June, July in Australia?
No, so I think the thing is that it's focusing on the impacts rather than thinking about the hot weather. And I think a lot of people get, it's 40 degrees Celsius, that is too hot, they shouldn't be playing. Whereas what we find is that if you have the right management system and the right decision making, actually is very viable to carry on having competition under those types of conditions, as long as the risk is understood and it's managed appropriately. This idea of adaptation. Now, it shouldn't mean that adaptation should be the only thing that we do, and we should give up on mitigation from a climate change perspective. Of course not. What we actually want to make sure that we're doing is that our adaptation efforts are not compromising our mitigation efforts as well at the same time. But I think what they're showing in the sporting context is that it is viable, it is possible to safely carry out these types of tournaments and activities under these heat stress conditions. But you've got to really think about it and invest in doing it properly. And I think what the problem is right now is that there's a lot of kind of deficit of effort and time and investment in these adaptation efforts across a lot of these different sports. Now, if everybody was doing that and we were still getting these impacts, these negative impacts, then maybe that's where you start saying, okay, well, we've done all we can to try to adapt and it's still not enough. The only thing we can do now is the ultimate adaptation, which is actually move the tournaments to cooler times of the year. But I don't think we're there yet. And I don't think we need to be there yet. I think we first need to really focus on evidence-based adaptation. And then, there's a variety of experts out there in the world who can help with this type of thing. And I think thinking about keeping the athletes cool despite the hot weather is probably the key to success.
Great. Thank you, Ollie. This has been really insightful. One thing we wanted to ask you is, do you have any literature or media that you would suggest our listeners read or listen to, watch, that might give them more information on this subject?
Well, obviously, they should be continuing to listen to this podcast. That's the first thing. In terms of a book, a book that I read many, many years ago, and I still recommend it to undergraduates who are interested in this area. It's called Life at the Extremes by Francis Ashcroft. It is an amazing little book that gives you kind of like a 101 on environmental physiology. It talks about heat and cold, talks about altitude, it talks about high pressure environments. And it's something that I think it's a beautiful book that is really captivating. And I think many of your listeners would enjoy reading that if they're interested in this area. One little thing I'll just quickly mention that we didn't have an opportunity to dive into is that for anybody who's interested in managing heat stress risk this coming summer in recreational sports, any sports that they're participating in, we've developed this thing called the University of Sydney Sports Heat Tool, and it delivers the Sports Medicine Australia Extreme Heat Policy. It's like a publicly accessible version of the Australian Open heat stress scale. It covers currently 40 different sports. It's linked to your nearest postcode, so it draws in from your nearest weather information. It's completely free and accessible. And we've actually just created a version which makes it available to all countries worldwide. So if you go to Google and you put Sports Heat Tool Sydney, it'll be the first hit. It's a web tool right now. We're looking at turning it into an actual app that you can download from the app store. There's a web tool that looks like an app that you can have on your phone, and it will be available for use in the US and other countries around the world this coming summer. There's this little flag at the top that you click on, and you can choose your country, and then you can choose from one of 40 sports. So if people are interested in kind of to have a first-hand experience of using some of this science that we've been generating, but it's completely free and available to anybody who wishes to use it.
Thank you, Ollie. That's a great resource, and we can put the link in the episode description, I think, so people can easily find it. And again, just thank you so much for talking with us today. The information you gave is so useful for people that are professional athletes and regular people like us. So thank you again.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Ollie.
Wow. Well, that Robbie was a great interview. There's so much for us to discuss. I think for our listeners to learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just hearing about how they operationalized the Australian Open heat system, and sort of Ollie's optimistic view of the fact that, there are levels of warning, and how that he sort of took the sort of elite athlete experience approach first to allow people to maintain the Australian Open in the height of the Australian summer in January, I thought was actually very impressive, and an example for other sports, which he did talk about. Yeah. And the Heat Watch app I'm very excited about too.
Yeah, and I felt like Ollie had a lot of really interesting, tips. The fan first, of course, using a fan before you turn on your air conditioning to really save on your energy bills, but also to, I don't know, help you kind of not rely on AC as much. The acclimatization, I assumed it was something that everyone should be doing and can do, but it sounds like it's really to do it to the level of a professional athlete can be dangerous and is probably unrealistic for most people. But there are certain things you can do to get a little of the way there, like, hot tub, sauna, exposing yourselves to these hot conditions for some period of time in a way that's safe and responsible.
Yeah, and then I liked also the idea that there are these high tech solutions, but at the end of the day, a lot of what can be achieved just by pouring water on yourself and allowing it to evaporate to transport the energy away from you, and that excess energy being one of the prime issues why you overheat and then get very sick. And so I found that we sort of are looking for solutions. I love finding simple solutions because those solutions can be used by the most people in the world. Yeah. And I think if you're going to run, deciding whether to drink or pour the water over your head, I think it is such a good example of maybe a paradigm shifting way that people can think differently.
Yeah, that was super fascinating. That's definitely something I'm going to be talking about for a long time after this. Is just how effective dumping water on your head is to cool you off. I mean, wow. And I know there's, often when you talk about heat with people, they're like, oh yeah, just stay hydrated. And right, it really highlights that there's a lot more you can do, both just with access to water, but also, hydration's important, but you can simulate sweating also, to help your body cool down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of different way of thinking about it as an excess of energy and then how best to transport that energy away from your body is, I think, the way that Ollie thinks about it, that I think the more people think about it in that way, I think the more that we can come up with solutions that actually work in the heat. Just to your point, Nate.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Surviving the Climate. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review it on Spotify and Apple Podcast. It really helps more people find the show. Also, for our Redditors out there, please check out the discussion. We will create a discussion post on our subreddit, rheat_prep. And there'll be a lot of discussion there. You can ask any questions or share any comments.
Yeah, that's really heating up for each of the previous episodes, isn't it, Nate? And for those not on Reddit, because not all of us are, please comment as much as you like on each of the episodes wherever you actually listen to us on your podcast, because that also helps. And the feedback is very useful too. To generally stay up to date with the podcast, follow us on social media at Surviving the Climate and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe if possible. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.